The following night, I found myself driving back toward the bridge. I can't explain why I went, not in rational terms. Fear, stubborn curiosity, the need to confront whatever had followed me home. Call it whatever you want, it had a pull, subtle and undeniable, and I could not resist it. The road was narrower than I remembered, shadows pressing closer, the trees bending inward like sentinels, waiting for me to make the mistake I had already made. Every mile felt endless, every curve a test of my resolve. The air in the car was stifling, thick with humidity and anticipation. The faint whisper of crying, almost inaudible at first, rode the wind around the vehicle, brushing against my consciousness, tugging at the edges of my sanity. I tried to reason it away. I tried to tell myself the sound was a trick, a phantom of memory, but deep inside, I knew better. It was waiting. The bridge had learned me, remembered me, and now it was drawing me back like a tide that cannot be fought. When I finally saw the bridge again, half hidden under the thick canopy of trees, I almost didn't stop. The moon was new, barely casting light, and the wooden planks gleamed black in the faint glow of my headlights. The water below reflecting nothing, no stars, no sky, only darkness. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes, and the air hit me with a weight I hadn't fully prepared for. The crying was closer now, almost tangible, emanating from beneath the bridge, curling around my feet, tugging at the hair on my arms. I leaned over the railing, heart hammering, and for the first time, I understood that the sound was no longer an echo of some distant tragedy. It was deliberate. It was directed. It was waiting for me to respond, to acknowledge it, to step fully into its world. I could feel it then, the air around me thickening, pressing in as if the night itself had gathered its patience and now exhaled it toward me in a slow, measured pulse. My body tensed. Every instinct screamed to run, to reverse the car and never look back, but my feet carried me forward, slowly, inexorably, toward the edge of the bridge. I knelt down on the cold, weathered wood, peering into the black water, and that's when it happened. The crying stopped for a heartbeat, and the silence was absolute, so complete that it pressed on my eardrums like a physical weight. Then I heard it, not a cry, not a sob, but a wet, almost human inhale, close enough that I could feel it brush against the back of my neck. I spun around, eyes wide, but the bridge was empty. The trees around me swayed gently, casting long, dancing shadows that did not belong to the shapes I could see. I swallowed hard, the air thick in my throat, and I realized with a sinking, hollow certainty that the entity was no longer confined to sound. It had learned to manipulate presence, to press itself into perception without being seen. Every instinct, every rational thought screamed at me to leave. But the draw of the crying, the pull of acknowledgement, rooted me in place. I could sense it beneath the bridge, along the railing, in the shadows that leaned toward me, patient and deliberate, testing the limits of my courage, probing the fragile barrier between fear and action. I took a shaky step back, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that the bridge was empty, that the crying was just wind or memory. And in that instant, a small ripple appeared in the water below, almost imperceptible, and the cry returned, rising in volume, now layered, as if the bridge had called to something else, something beneath the surface, something that had waited for me all this time. The sobs were insistent now, a chorus of loss, fragile and wrong in ways the human ear should never perceive. I pressed my forehead against the railing, unable to look at the water, unable to run, caught between the terror of acknowledgement and the terror of ignorance. For the first time, I understood fully why the stories existed. Crybaby Bridge was not just a legend, it was a sentinel, collector of attention and fear, patient and relentless, waiting for those foolish or brave enough to cross its threshold. And I had, against every instinct, chosen to step into its reach once more. By the time I returned home from the bridge that night, something had shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a room slightly colder than it should be, or a shadow that lingered just a heartbeat too long in the corner of my eye. But the shift was undeniable, and I could feel it pressing into me, threading itself into my thoughts, my nerves, the very rhythm of my breathing. The crying was no longer just a sound. It had become a presence, tangible and oppressive, curling around my limbs as I moved through the apartment. I could feel the temperature drop when it came close, heard the floorboards whisper beneath its weight even though the apartment remained empty. I tried to keep busy, to focus on ordinary tasks, anything that might anchor me to the mundane, but even opening a cabinet or shifting a chair brought the faint, unmistakable sound of soft weeping closer. It was testing me, measuring my reactions, learning the boundaries of fear, and I realized that this was no longer something I could ignore or escape. At around 2 in the morning, the crying changed. It no longer floated in the background. It filled the room, surrounding me with impossible proximity. I could feel it brushing against my hair, crawling along my shoulders in subtle, cold traces, a sensation that made my skin crawl. It was as if the bridge itself had followed me, no longer content to wait at a distance. I tried to scream, tried to run, but my voice was swallowed by the thick, heavy air and my legs felt like lead. Every step I took seemed to bring the sobbing closer, sharper, more insistent. I could feel it almost kneeling beside me, leaning into my chest with a weight that wasn't mine. I pressed my hands to my ears, thinking the noise might recede, but it didn't. The sound adopted, bending, moving around my attempts to shut it out, entering my mind in waves that made my temples throb and my chest ache. I realized with a sinking, hollow dread that the entity had learned more than just presence. It had learned attention, and it thrived on it. Then came the first truly unignorable manifestation. The lights flickered, soft and slow, at first, then violent, bathing the apartment in erratic shadows. I felt the air press heavier against my face, cold and wet in the way of something alive. My furniture groaned in a manner that no house should, the subtle creaks and thuds of settling amplifying into a deliberate cadence, a rhythm almost mimicking a heartbeat. I froze, and in that pause, in that unbearable stillness, I heard a new sound, not crying, not sobbing, but a small, wet, desperate gasp, as if someone or something had just been pulled from water, gasping for breath, and it was right there in the center of the room. My eyes darted frantically, but saw nothing. The apartment looked ordinary, yet every instinct told me otherwise. I could feel the entity in the space around me, in the empty air, in the shadows that refused to remain fixed, wrapping itself in ways my senses couldn't name. It was no longer just sound. It was sensation, presence, intent, and it was patient. Hours or perhaps minutes, I cannot know, passed in this way. I did not move from the center of the living room, not daring to sit or lie down, not daring to close my eyes, barely daring to breathe. The crying came and went, layered now with the soft, wet gasps that the faintest dragging of something along the floor whispers that weren't quite words but were intelligible enough to set my teeth on edge. Sleep was impossible. Sanctuary was impossible. The bridge had found a way to follow me beyond its threshold, spreading the essence of its grief and malice into my space, and it was learning how far it could reach before I broke completely. I realized then that I had underestimated it. Crybaby Bridge was not just a place of sorrow. It was an intelligence, patient, relentless, deliberate, and it had chosen me to learn from. I was no longer the observer of a legend. I was the subject, and the night was only beginning. That night, the apartment no longer felt like a place I inhabited. It was a labyrinth built by the bridge itself, corridors and corners rearranged in ways that only I could perceive. I moved carefully, every step deliberate, every breath shallow, but it made no difference. The crying came immediately, sharper now, closer, a wet, almost desperate sound, as if the entity had found its way into the very marrow of my bones. I pressed myself against the wall of the hallway, palms flat, trying to ground myself, trying to convince my body that I could remain separate from whatever had followed me home. But the sound moved with me, weaving through the rooms, circling, pausing when I paused, escalating when I dared glance into a shadow. It was no longer just auditory. It had begun to interact with me physically, pressing against my nerves in a way that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. I could feel its presence brushing against the back of my neck, fingers of cold brushing my shoulders, subtle enough that I could not locate them, yet terrifyingly real. I tried to flee to the bedroom, thinking if I barricaded myself with lights, noise, anything, I could create a safe zone. But as soon as I reached the threshold, the crying changed tone, rising into a high, heaving wail, and something shifted in the room itself. The air felt thicker and the temperature dropped until every breath burned my lungs. I could hear faint, wet scratches along the hardwood, slow, deliberate, testing my attention, and I realized with a dread I could not speak that the entity was no longer content with observation. It was experimenting, pressing the limits of its reach, exploring my reactions like a scientist recording measurements. I pressed my hands to my face, rocking slightly, murmuring desperate reassurances to myself that this was impossible, that it wasn't real. But the scratches grew bolder, followed by something that sounded like soft, wet footsteps moving over the carpet, circling, closer, always closer. And then I saw it, though not fully, not clearly, only a shade, a shimmer at the edge of vision. A figure hunched, small, disproportionate, impossibly thin, its outline trembling like smoke in a draught. I blinked and it was gone. But the air was heavier, and the crying intensified, layered now with a wet gasp that made my chest ache. It had learned me completely. It understood that fear was the instrument by which it could reach me most effectively. My muscles locked in place, every fiber of my body screaming to move, but my mind was paralyzed, caught between disbelief and the suffocating understanding that the bridge had followed me, had learned me, had become an active, deliberate presence. I could feel it in the walls, in the floor beneath my feet, pressing close enough that the hairs on my arms stood straight up, every nerve screaming that I was not alone. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. I dared not close my eyes. I dared not sleep, and I dared not move more than a few steps at a time. The sobbing had become a constant presence, no longer rising and falling with distance, but threading through the apartment, tangible, real, almost corporeal. At one point, I swear I felt a small weight settle on the edge of my bed, soft, wet, pressing down as though something tiny had perched there, waiting for my attention. I froze too, terrified to turn, too aware that acknowledging it would give it more power, but unable to resist the horrifying need to know. The air shimmered in that moment, heavy and wet, and I realized that I could no longer pretend this was just auditory hallucination. Crybaby Bridge had crossed into my world completely. It was not a place. It was not a memory. It was a living presence, patient, relentless, and it had claimed me as part of its domain. By the time the first gray hints of dawn touched the windows, I understood a truth I could not deny. Whatever I had stirred that night on the bridge had followed me into the fabric of my life, into the rooms where I thought I was safe, into the corners of reality that I had assumed were mine alone. It was patient, it was deliberate, and it was waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next flicker of fear, to draw me further into the darkness that had always belonged to Crybaby Bridge. I realized then, with a sinking clarity, that I could never leave it behind, that the bridge was no longer distant water and rotting wood, but a living, breathing, persistent force that had made me part of its world, whether I wanted to belong or not. By the 10th night, I wasn't living in my apartment anymore. I was surviving inside it. The hours between sunset and dawn had become a single, stretched out moment of anticipation, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the crying to begin. And it always began, not like before, not faint and distant, not drifting like an echo beneath old planks, but immediate, close, intimate, already inside the room before I could even convince myself I was alone. The sobbing no longer felt like sound traveling through air. It felt like pressure traveling through thought, like something reaching into the softest parts of my mind and pressing gently until I flinched. I stopped checking logs. I stopped leaving lights on. I stopped pretending there was a boundary between the bridge and my life. That boundary had dissolved the moment I leaned over that railing, the moment I listened too long, the moment I allowed myself to wonder what might be crying in the dark. That night, the crying didn't rise gradually. It started as a whisper directly behind my ear, so close I felt warmth that shouldn't have existed, followed by a wet inhale that made my stomach twist. I spun around so fast I nearly fell, heart slamming against my ribs, but the room was empty. Empty in the way a stage is empty right before the curtain lifts. The air was wrong, dense, damp, heavy with the smell of stagnant water, like the underside of the bridge had seeped through the walls. I could feel it everywhere, not as a figure, not as a shape, but as a deliberate occupation of space. The crying moved slowly through the apartment as if it had learned how to walk without footsteps, how to pace without weight, how to circle without being seen, and I realized with a sudden clarity that terrified me more than any scream, it wasn't wandering anymore. It was searching. I backed into the hallway, trying to keep my breathing quiet, trying not to react, because reaction was the only language it understood. The sobbing softened, almost pleased, then shifted again, thin and careful, like it was practicing. It wasn't grief the way humans feel grief. It was an imitation of grief, worn like a mask. The sound drew closer to the bedroom, then stopped. Silence dropped so hard it felt like gravity increased. My ears rang with it. Then, from inside the bedroom, I heard something that froze every part of me, the faint creak of my mattress compressing, slow and deliberate, as if something small had climbed onto it and settled there to wait. I stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to look away. The crying returned, muffled now, as though pressed into fabric, as though whatever was making it had turned its face into my pillow. A childlike sound, an impossible sound. My hands trembled so violently I had to grip the door frame to stay upright. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to run that wasn't still inside the radius of the bridge. My apartment felt miles away from the bridge in geography, but not in reality. Reality had folded. The bridge wasn't a place anymore. It was a presence that could stretch, that could travel, that could settle into the spaces where you sleep. The lights flickered once, twice, then went dead completely. Not a power outage, something cleaner, more intentional, as if the darkness had simply decided it no longer needed permission. In the black, the crying became clearer, sharper, and I realized it wasn't coming from one point. It was coming from everywhere at once, layered and surrounding as though the apartment itself had learned how to weep. My breath turned shallow. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and panicked, and beneath it, that soft, wet sound again, like water dripping off something that had just climbed out of a river. And I felt it. Not a brush of cold air, not a suggestion, a touch, a small, damp pressure against my wrist, like fingers that were too light to belong on an adult, too cold to belong to anything living. I jerked back with a strangled sound, and in the instant my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I saw the faintest distortion in front of me, a shape defined only by the absence of light, hunched low, impossibly still. The crying faltered, then resumed, softer now, almost satisfied, as if it had finally confirmed what it wanted, that I could feel it, that it could reach me. I stumbled backward, chest heaving, mind screaming that this was not possible, that this was not real, that no bridge could do this, no legend could crawl out of water and into an apartment. But the smell of damp wood and stagnant river water filled my lungs. The air pressed in from all sides. The sobbing continued, patient and close, no longer asking for attention, but assuming it. And I understood then, with a clarity that made my stomach drop into something like despair, that this wasn't haunting the way people tell stories about hauntings. This was attachment. This was possession of space. Crybaby Bridge had found a way to step beyond its own threshold. It was no longer content to be a sound in the distance. It wanted proximity. It wanted intimacy. It wanted the final step. And somewhere in the darkness, inches from where I stood trembling, the crying shifted into something almost like a laugh, small, wet, broken, before falling back into that patient, endless sob. By the 11th night, the apartment had become something unrecognizable. It was no longer merely a home. It had become an extension of the bridge itself. A space where fear was solid and tangible, where walls pressed in just slightly too close and shadows moved with a consciousness that was mine only in part. The crying no longer wandered. It had a rhythm, a pulse, and it responded to me, to my movements, my breathing, my heartbeats. It was no longer patient in the way it had been before. It was deliberate, insistent, testing the limits of my awareness and endurance. I could feel it brushing against my knees when I knelt, curling around my arms when I reached for a light switch, pressing on my back when I leaned against a wall. It was as if the bridge itself had entered the apartment, carrying the weight of its own grief, its own stubborn, persistent claim, and it would not be denied. I remember standing in the kitchen, frozen mid-step, when the crying stopped entirely. The silence was heavier than any sound, thick with expectation, and I realized with a gut-sinking awareness that this pause was not mercy. It was preparation. My head jerked slightly to the corner of the room, and there, just beyond the reach of the dim streetlight filtering through the blinds, I saw it. Not fully formed, not a clear figure, but a movement in the shadows. Small, hunched, impossibly slight, wet in texture, as if it had just risen from water. Its presence pressed into my chest, cold and deliberate. The air smelt damp and rotten, like riverwood left to decay, and the sobbing returned, layered with something else, a subtle, deliberate sound that mimicked my own breathing, my own heartbeat. I realized then, with a clarity that made my stomach churn, that Crybaby Bridge had found a way to imitate me, to mock me, to occupy not just the space around me, but the perception of myself. It was no longer enough to fear the sound. I had to fear the space I had always trusted as my own body, my own mind. I sank to the floor, hands over my face, whispering desperate prayers, words that had no power against it, and then it shifted. A small, wet press against my shoulder, deliberate and teasing, coaxing me upright. My body obeyed, and in that moment, the crying grew louder, sharper, layering in tones I could not name, childlike, human, unnatural. I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that it had learned not only how to follow me, but how to manipulate me. It had found the precise mix of fear, curiosity, and exhaustion that made me its willing participant. I wanted to resist, to flee, to destroy the connection by ignoring it, but my limbs were no longer mine to command. They moved with the rhythm it established, and I realized with a frozen clarity that it wanted me to act, that it was coaxing me, that the bridge was no longer just a place behind me. It had become a force, shaping my world, pressing into my decisions. The realization struck me like ice through bone. Crying wasn't just trying to draw me back to the bridge. It wasn't waiting for my return for simple closure or curiosity or even for revenge. It wanted me to carry it forward, to give it form, to allow it to cross into the tangible world beyond memory and shadow. I could feel the insistence in the sobs now, layered with wet, soft pressures against my ankles, my wrists, my back, as if it were testing my limits, measuring how far it could reach before I broke completely. Every instinct screamed at me to fight, but the entity had already learned my fears, my weakness, my pattern of thought. My will, once my own, had become a bridge to, a channel for its presence, patient and unyielding. I understood then that the bridge was not a story. It was not a memory. It was a living, learning, sentient force, patient beyond comprehension, capable of stretching its fingers into any space I occupied, any moment I believed was mine alone. And as the first hints of dawn touched the apartment, weak and gray, the crying softened, almost satisfied, and I knew with a terror that would not leave me that this was not an ending. It was preparation. The bridge had claimed a piece of me. It had entered my life fully, and when it returned, because it always would not be content with sound, with pressure, with presence. It would want more. The 12th night arrived like a slow storm, carrying with it the oppressive weight of every hour I had spent listening, watching, and waiting. The apartment was no longer a safe harbor, no longer a place that belonged to me. Every corner, every shadow, every floorboard seemed infused with the same cold, wet insistence that had followed me from the bridge. The crying had become omnipresent, no longer tied to a location, no longer a sound I could hope to escape. It pressed against me in every moment of stillness, moved through the apartment in rhythms I could not anticipate, and carried with it a sentience I could no longer deny. I realized with a fear so deep it felt like it would hollow me out entirely that the bridge had not just followed me, it had learned me, adapted to me, become a part of the spaces I once called private. It had crossed the boundary between legend and reality, and it would not be deterred. That night, I could feel it everywhere at once. The sobbing layered over itself, becoming a chorus that filled every inch of air, vibrating in my bones. I could feel wet, cold pressures against my shoulders, my wrists, the back of my knees, impossibly light yet unbearably insistent. I stumbled through the apartment, instinct guiding me more than reason, moving from room to room as if I could outrun it. But there was nowhere to run. The space had become elastic, warped by the presence of something that had once been a place but now was a living, patient entity. The crying adjusted to my panic, rising and falling, almost conversational now, teaching me through its cadence exactly how I terrified I could become before it escalated further. And then I felt it. Not a pressure, not a shadow, but a cold, wet contact on my neck, brushing as lightly as a finger, deliberate and intimate. I spun around, desperate to see, desperate to confront, but there was nothing visible, only the sense of it, of the bridge itself pressing into my life, into my perception, into the very essence of what I thought was mine. I realized then that this was the moment it had been preparing for all along. The bridge had been patient, observant, learning my habits, the rhythms of my fear, the precise limits of my endurance, and now, after 12 nights, it was asserting control fully, crying intensified, layered with wet gasps, small, deliberate shuffles, whispers that I could not comprehend but understood instinctively as intent. It was no longer testing me. It was claiming me. Every instinct screamed to fight, to flee, to deny it, but the entity had anticipated every possible reaction, had mapped the way my mind would twist in panic, had manipulated the rhythm of my thoughts with precision I could not hope to match. The apartment felt alive, hostile, yet intimate, walls breathing, shadows pressing, air vibrating with unspoken command. I could feel the bridge everywhere, in the floorboards, in the shadows, in the corners of my vision where the darkness seemed thicker, more patient, more knowing. The sobbing reached a peak and then, for a heartbeat, stopped. Silence descended, heavy and deliberate, as if the world had paused to watch, and in that silence it felt fully the bridge, not a place but a presence, hovering at the edge of perception, wrapping around my very being. I could feel its claim, its patient insistence, its unyielding demand that I acknowledge it. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to shut out the sound, trying to deny the weight, but there was no denying it. It had crossed the threshold of sound and space, entered my life completely, and I realized with a chilling clarity that I had no choice but to accept its presence. The crying resumed, soft now, coaxing, insistent, teaching me that there is no leaving, no detachment, no escape from something that has made itself a part of your world. Hours or minutes passed in that state of suspended terror. My senses stretched to their limits. The entity never faltered, never grew impatient. It simply existed in a rhythm I could no longer control, shaping the space, shaping my perception, shaping me. And in that infinite moment, I understood the truth of the stories. Crybaby Bridge is not a legend bound by geography. It's a force, patient and deliberate, moving with intent, threading itself into the lives of those who listen, those who acknowledge it, those foolish or brave enough to return. I understood then that I could never undo what had begun the night I leaned over its railing, that the bridge had followed me home, and that it had made me a part of its world forever. I was no longer simply a survivor of stories. I was a witness, a participant, a vessel for the sorrow it carried, and the sobbing continued around me, patient, intimate, unrelenting, teaching me that some cries never stop and some bridges never let go.